All right. Hey guys, we've got top of the hour. Welcome to the COCA medical call tonight. We have Dr. Rafi as our guest speaker. Thank you for joining us. I am Jennifer Amundsen, the assistant executive director for COCA, and it has been a long day, but I am glad I'm here, and I'm glad all you guys are here too. So tonight, Dr. Kay Wagner, COCA-I president, will be our moderator, and Dr. Kay, take it away. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know this is going to be a great discussion and topic of interest for all of us. Little housekeeping, if you haven't already or haven't heard me say, please remember to change your name on your screen so we know your name and your camp. And if you would please turn your video on so we can see everyone who's participating, that would be great. If you do have questions throughout this session, because this really is a session for our participants, you can either pipe in and ask or put them in the chat room. We'll be monitoring that. And we're going to have this be probably about 45 minutes long. We'll start with a little introduction with Dr. Rafi, and then we'll open it up to questions. So we are fortunate tonight to be joined by Dr. Rafael Landovitz. I think I said that right. Known to Dr. Rafi as those of us who get to work with him. He is an infectious disease physician at UCLA, and then is on the Health and Wellness Committee for Camp Tecumseh. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Rafi, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. K. It's really a treat to be invited back to talk with everyone again. So thanks for having me. If it's okay, I'm going to try and share my screen. I did make a couple of slides just to sort of get us all on the same page, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I know we're all so Zoom professional at this point that there's no chance that any technology will go sideways, right? Sure. I also want to apologize that these slides are really uncampy. I apologize. I really should have spent more time with pictures and cartoons and making them awesome, and I didn't, so I apologize. There is one joke, and you can feel free to laugh or not. Rick Brundage, I'm counting on you to laugh. Okay, so COVID-19 and vaccines, what's the state of the science? Where are we for Camp 2021? Where are we? We are here in the United States. I think everyone's aware we're just coming down off of the third wave, the largest wave that we've had in the pandemic since this all began a year ago. It's really unthinkable that this has all been the last year. I think when we all look back at what we were doing and what we were thinking a year ago, it's sort of unimaginable what's happened in the interim. And I just want to take a moment and acknowledge how stressful and hard and really unthinkable is the only word for everything that has transpired in the last 12 months. And what I am continually impressed by and what gives me ongoing hope is the creativity, the resiliency, the brilliance, the positivity of people like all of you who continue to fight despite all of this to create magical experiences for the kids that are entrusted to us for a camping experience. So, you know, I think what is giving a lot of people concern, even as things start to look rosier at the end of this third wave of the epidemic, is you'll notice over here on the very end, is it seems like that beautiful downward decline that had been happening sort of since the beginning of February seems to be petering off. It kind of dips back up a tiny bit there at the end, and it seems to be losing a little bit of its steam. And no one really understands why things started getting better at the beginning of February, and no one really understands why things are sort of plateauing a little bit. So anytime you don't know the answer to something, it's always kind of dangerous to say, well, it's because of X and I'm 100% sure about it. And then it's hard to know what to do next. The best sort of theories that I have heard of is the reason we had that steep decline and things got so much better so quickly um, is this notion of we had a big surge after the Christmas and New Year's holidays that was sort of peaking and then getting better. We started vaccinating people, but that's sort of a very small impact so far on this improvement. Perhaps people got scared and adhered to social distancing, masking, those sorts of non-pharmacologic measures a little bit better, and perhaps people are fatigued from that and now are beginning to get a little bit more relaxed about what's happening, and perhaps that's something that's causing things to plateau a little bit. The other thing that scares me a lot, to be honest, and we'll talk about this, is the rise of these more transmissible and more serious resistant variants, and the fact that we're a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of our monitoring for them here in the US, and whether that's going to contribute to a 4th wave. And we've heard the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, come out today and say that this is the wrong time to relax our guard and stop these social distancing, mask wearing, hand washing, protective measures that we've been doing as we scale up vaccination. So we'll be talking more about that, but I think there's a reason to really not let our guard down here out of fear that a lot of this beautiful progress that we see here could be reversed by some of these variants, and we'll talk more about that. So where are we, right? I think everybody's heard that we now have 3 vaccines that have received emergency use authorization, or EUA, by the FDA. 2 of them have been around for a little bit of time now, right? Moderna and Pfizer. And both of them have been shown to be more than 90% effective. One was 94.5%, one was 95%. And I just have a little asterisk there because I just want to be really clear about what that 95% effective means. That's not 95% effective at preventing people from getting infected. That's 95% protective against people having the clinical disease of being sick with COVID. So that's really important to understand. And you've probably heard public health officials and other people saying, well, I mean, does that mean that you can't still get it? And does that mean that you can't still infect other people? And the honest answer is no one is sure yet. So that's an unknown. But what's really important to know is that it's actually 100% effective at the thing we most care about. And that's against the most serious and critical forms of the disease that land people in the hospital on a ventilator and cause them to pass away from COVID. And that's really important. And I give that as context because the J&J, Johnson & Johnson, also called the Janssen vaccine. People are confused. Is that the same? Is that different? Same thing. Janssen is a company that's now owned by Johnson & Johnson. That's the one that just got its emergency use authorization on Saturday of this past weekend and has just been signed off on by the American College of Immunization Professionals and the CDC in the last 48 hours. And that sort of comes up with an estimate of its efficacy in the 70 to 80% range. And it's a single dose as opposed to the other 2, which are 2 doses. And you've probably heard a lot about it can also be stored in a refrigerator as opposed to needing deep freeze. And this could have a big impact on the epidemic and increasing supply. And a lot of people say, goodness, if I get offered the J&J vaccine, I don't want it because I want the more effective vaccine. And I really want to caution people about thinking that way because the J&J vaccine is also highly, highly protective against those super severe presentations of the disease that land people in the hospital on ventilators and passing away from the virus. So if it were able to turn it into a mild flu, I think we'd all take that. So if that's what is offered to someone, I really want to encourage people to take whatever they're offered because I'll tell you, it's practically a certainty that down the line, we're all going to need boosters of some sort, and maybe boosters that are going to address some of these variants that are coming around. So get what you can now, and then plan on getting something else later. That's my sort of public service message about this. There are a bunch of other vaccines that are in various stages of testing. Some of them have been in the news, some of them less so. I think people have heard a lot about the AstraZeneca vaccine that sort of had a little bit of a checkered pathway and isn't yet approved in the US, but is approved in Canada, the UK, Europe, Brazil, other places. And the Novavax vaccine that's also moving its way through development. There's some additional ones too. And I just want to go over sort of briefly what we know about each of these. I want to be super quick because I don't want us to go down a rabbit hole of science here. But I do want to just break it down that there are 4 big categories of types of vaccine. And mRNA vaccine is the kind of vaccine that Pfizer and Moderna are. And what those are is they're little chemical daisy chains of genetic material that get injected into people's muscle, then taken up by cells. And basically, it's the building blocks that lets the cells make one of the M&M candy coatings that's on the outside of the virus, and then shows it to the immune system to generate an immune response and get the immune system prepared in case it sees the actual virus. The AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson or Janssen vaccine are a little bit different. They have basically a common cold virus that someone's pulled the Oreo cream filling out of the center of and put in the genetic material to, again, make this spike protein or that M&M that I mentioned that's in the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines and show it to the immune system. So it uses sort of a Trojan horse of a fake cold virus that can't actually cause disease in a person to introduce this little nugget of the COVID-19 virus and show it to the immune system. And then the more classic kind of vaccines that are available are ones that take a chunk of the virus sort of naked and show it to the immune system without using either a cold virus or using the genetic material. And Novavax and another one by a company called Sanofi are in studies about that. And you'll be hearing more about that. And some people like that idea because it's been used in other vaccines that have gotten approved. And so it makes them more comfortable that the technology is more standardized and more studied. And then there's something that we don't have any examples of in the US yet, but it's sort of this concept of you take the actual virus that causes the disease and you take a weakened version of it and you infect somebody with it. And that's called a live vector vaccine. And there's an example of that being developed in China. And we don't have that here. And I think probably it wouldn't get a lot of excitement around here because the concept of infecting someone with a mild case of COVID, I think doesn't sit well with people conceptually, even if it were to work fairly well. I think people are concerned it would be risky. So super quick, these mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, this is the Pfizer vaccine, and you don't need to be a clinical trial specialist or a doctor to see something that's pretty obvious here. This is what happens when you give people either the active vaccine or the placebo, which is the way these studies are done. And the blue people are, every tick up here that you see a blue box is somebody getting COVID. And this is what happens over time in the people who got the fake vaccine. And in the red is what happened when they gave people 2 shots of the Pfizer vaccine. And you don't need to be a scientist at all to see that basically after about 2 weeks after that second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, not a whole lot of people got COVID who got the Pfizer vaccine, but people kept on getting COVID in the ones who got the placebo. So this is that 94.5, 95% efficacy result that you've been hearing a lot about. This is the same curve for the Mrna vaccine. And you can see the same sort of thing. The gray is the placebo, the blue is the Mrna vaccine. And you can see what happens in the gray. People keep getting COVID when they got the placebo, and really nothing happens much in the people who got the Mrna vaccine. So those are the actual data. Now you've seen it, just in case you were sort of feeling nerdy and wanted to see it like I do. The AstraZeneca and the Janssen vaccines, I'm going to show you super quick, similar kinds of stuff. The AstraZeneca vaccine has sort of had a tarnished history. And I say that because the company kind of messed up, and they figured out as they were doing their studies that in the United Kingdom, where they were doing their study, they kind of gave people a half dose the first time by mistake. And then they sort of figured that out, and they gave them a full dose that they meant to give the second time. And they sort of had an oopsie sort of moment. And they found out that it looked like that worked better than the people who got full dose. And so now you're left with this, well, how does that make any sense? And the fact that they weren't transparent about that up front made people question, what they're doing. How do you make that sort of mistake? And now there's some very bizarre findings with, even though it has approvals in all these countries, that it actually seems like it works better the longer you separate the two vaccine doses. Wait, what? Yeah. So it's been given in a lot of the trials a month apart, the two doses, which is how we give a lot of these vaccines. And it looks like it actually works better if you separate the two doses by 3 months. Huh. Yeah, so that doesn't have an emergency use authorization yet. We haven't seen the US data. So stay tuned for more about that. That's one of those viral vectors, the cold viral vector ones. And this is that same sort of plot for the J&J vaccine. And the red here is the placebo people, and the blue here and the vaccine people. And you see this blue one isn't quite as flat as it was in the Pfizer and Moderna plots that I showed you. And that's what people are sort of pointing at, that it doesn't seem to be quite as effective for more mild cases of disease, but it's still highly, highly effective against super severe disease that lands people in the hospitals. Now, some of you have already started checking your email or your Facebook or your Instagram account, because this is way too much science. So now everybody pay attention, come back, look at this, screenshot this. This is the one thing you need to know. If you didn't listen to a single other thing I said, here's what we know today. And this has to do with the variants. And they've sort of got wonky, goofy names, but this is what we know is today. So the first column here is the efficacy of each vaccine for any disease, mild, moderate, severe. And that B117, that's the UK variant that you're hearing about. They think that's the one that's causing the outbreak at University of Vermont and at Dartmouth and in a number of other college campuses. This is the one that's 30 to 50% more contagious, but it's not thought to be like more severe in the disease it causes. So it's more contagious, but if you get it, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a worse outcome. So the vaccine seems to work the same in the regular, which we call the wild type virus, and that one. So you can see that level of protection for all these different vaccines. And then in that second column there where the blue is, that's a question that everybody wants to know the answer to, right? Does it prevent infection at all? That could mean you don't have any symptoms. It means getting infected at all. And we think that means could you transmit it to someone else also? So these are largely estimates extrapolated from fairly limited data, but this is the state of the science as of today. So like I said, hopefully you're all screenshotting this. But then we come to these other variants in the last two columns, the green and the gray one. And this is what is sobering, right? So the B1351 thing, that's the one from South Africa, and the P1, that's the one from Brazil. And those are the ones that are both more contagious and seem to have much more severe disease associated with them. That is more hospitalization, more life-threatening illness, more death. And you can see that they have reduced protection from the currently available vaccines. So it's pretty clear to me that what's going to happen with these increased contagiousness viruses floating around, even forget the ones that have more serious outcomes, is this is going to be a game of whack-a-mole, right? We're going to reduce some cases of infection pretty good with the main circulating type, but if these variants start taking hold, then they're going to be less protective, and we're still going to have cases, and they're going to have to keep adjusting the vaccines, and we're going to have to pivot. So we can't stop our social distancing, our masking, our hand washing, all these other protective measures that don't involve a vaccine until we really can, like I said, play the game of whack-a-mole and keep smacking this down until it kind of burns out. As long as there are high rates of new infections, this thing is going to keep mutating and changing. And that's what's driving this. The one thing that's going to stop this being an endless cycle is if we get the new infections down. Because basically every time it infects somebody new, it has an opportunity to, like, do you guys remember Press Your Luck, that game show? I'm dating myself as being really old. You know, they would, you know, it was like this slot machine sort of game, and they would go big bucks, no whammies, big bucks, no, and they would push some plunger, and then like it would stop. And if it stopped at this little cartoon character, it would like a whammy would come out and you'd go bankrupt, like Wheel of Fortune. But anyway, where was I going with that? All right. So the point is, you know, every time it infects somebody new, it takes an opportunity to laugh at you like the whammy does. That's where I was going with that. And take a chance to optimize its transmission abilities. So the only way that we're going to stop these variants from being generated, thank you, Dave Cat, for putting that in the chat, and stop, exactly, is to really get the infection rates down. And the only thing we have to guarantee that is going to be the social distancing stuff. So anyway, hope you screenshotted that because we're moving on. And the main thing I think people really have questions and tons of questions about is kids. When are we going to be vaccinating kids? I mean, forget the what we're going to be vaccinating kids with, because I just basically told you that we're going to need more and different vaccines. But here's what we know. The Pfizer vaccine began a trial of 12 to 16-year-olds in the fall. I have not heard yet when they expect to have results from that, but at least it's in process. The Mrna trial started a trial of 12 to 18-year-olds in December. AstraZeneca, and I've already kind of panned AstraZeneca to you a little bit on this call, so you can decide how excited you want to be. They've announced a trial down to age 6, and we don't have any information yet from the J&J trial or others, but they have said that they do want to have a pediatric program. But I think the short answer is we're still a fairly long way away from having data that's going to support the use of these vaccines in kids, at least before the summer or fall of this year, probably before we have data that's going to allow expanded use. And certainly it's going to be even longer before we have data in people with immune compromised conditions. So I think that's an extra layer to add on to that. I want to stop there because I've already talked at you for 25 minutes, and I'm sure I've generated more questions than I've answered, but hopefully that's a good starting point, and that people will stop checking their email and now will ask questions. Thanks.
Dr. Rafi, I just want to say thank you. That was an amazing introduction to what we needed to know and answered, I think, a ton of questions already. So thank you so much for that. If I could start off with a question that's probably on all of our minds, what do you think are the maybe key 1 or 2 factors that people should look at to decide about having camp or not having camp?
Yeah, that's sort of the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Yep.
You know, we've talked about this a lot at Tecumseh, and there are no easy answers here. I think what we at Tecumseh, there are a number of other folks from Tecumseh on the call, so I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think what we keep coming back to in our conversations, and I know this has also been part of the conversations in these forums at COCA, is you never want to be in the position of regretting that you decided to have camp. As hard and as painful as it is to make the decision to not have in-person camp, and as important it is to have the mental health benefits for these kids. I think we keep coming back to that issue. So I think what's really going to drive decisions about being able to have camp safely is what is happening with that trajectory of case rates in people's regions throughout the country, what the status is of the vaccine availability for staff who can take it, and what we can sort of understand about general COCA and CDC guidance about allowing immune compromised kids to be in that sort of group setting together. And unfortunately, the pieces of the puzzle are moving so rapidly that it's virtually impossible to know what this summer is going to look like. Is it going to completely go away and burn out and it's going to be a non-issue? Gosh, I hope so. Do I really think so? No. I think it's much more likely we're going to have a fourth wave, from some of these resistant variants, and we're going to be playing this well into the summer. I think, therefore, it's forcing a lot of camp programs to make some decisions that are really hard now, and hoping against hope that things do go in a good direction and people can pivot at the last minute and do something in person if we're really, really lucky. But I think my gut is this summer it's going to be really a very difficult process to make it safe for kids to be in person together. That's just my opinion.
One other question that I know has come up in some of the previous town halls. Are there rules about being able to enforce vaccine use for staff if they're eligible to get it? And how does that play into some of our decisions?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. K. That's a really great question, and it's actually pretty clear. The answer is, as long as vaccines are only authorized under this process called EUA, Emergency Use Authorization, you can't legally mandate them for anyone. If one of them gets a formal FDA regulatory approval, then you actually can. Whether or not you should, I'm sure it's something that we could debate and probably will debate, but until there is such an approval, it's a non-issue. You can't.
Thank you. Looks like we say, Diane is saying the CDC recently made changes to their website that explicitly list camp staff in phase 1B of the vaccine prioritization.
That's great. I wish I could say that that made me feel like it would be still safe, because I am afraid that if this UK or Brazil variant ends up being predominant by this summer, even vaccine protection isn't going to make it safe to have an in-person camp.
Question, is your camp considering any screening test protocols, like, screen a week before, 3 days before, and day of arrival, or something else that extreme?
I think this is public. Dennis, if you're on, you can tell me to shut up if it's not. We've made the decision to not do in-person programming for this year in its entirety. So we have not gone that route. Personally, I think it would be really challenging to implement such a procedure. You need to have essentially all staff on site and essentially quarantined for 14 days with testing protocols before you would be comfortable doing that. And then the question is, what about the kids? And I have not seen any guidance about how to implement any sort of protocol that would be practical to be able to bring kids into that environment. And of course, I think many camps have people on staff who are former campers and may be immune compromised or have gone through chemotherapy and treatment themselves, and may not, or we don't know how people who've been through chemotherapy and treatment respond to these vaccines yet. Remember that the majority of those individuals were excluded from participation in these trials. So it seems like it would be a reasonable assumption they would be safe, but do they work and how well? So whether or not you're going to put staff at risk in that way becomes an extra layer of complexity to all of this.
Yeah, I agree, but I've seen non-COCA camps considering algorithms like that and was curious. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it may be a very different calculus when you're dealing with kids who are not immune compromised. Honestly, I still would have a lot of anxiety about it, but I think there's a lot more of sort of an argument for there might be a way to do it safely. With kids with immune compromise, I think the risk benefit becomes really, really, really even more complicated.
Dr. Rafi, what about doing sibling camps or, family camps where maybe someone on treatment isn't part of that?
I think it's a great question. The question I always come back to is, if you have someone in a congregate setting and then they go home to a kid with immune compromise, what about that? And, I don't pretend to have all the answers. And I think some people are probably thinking, my God, he's so conservative about this. He's never going to let us do anything. Believe me, as someone who's been a volunteer at Tecumseh for 27 years, I absolutely appreciate how critical it is for our campers and our families to be back together in person. And I want as much as all of you to find a safe way to do that. So just I just want to give that caveat to this, I feel like I'm painting myself in a very negative box here.
We appreciate that you're being asked some challenging questions here, so we certainly appreciate that you're tackling them. Dennis is saying he thought we were allowed to require vaccines for paid staff, but that we were not allowed to require for paid staff, but we could for volunteers. Did I read that right, Dennis?
Yeah, that was the read from our legal counsel, that the laws are very clear that we cannot require paid staff, but for volunteer staff, we are able to require it.
So that's interesting, Den. I was told that that's not true if it's under an EUA. Do you know if the legal team sort of looked into that nuance?
I don't know if that nuance was actually evaluated, but that's what we're currently going on, but I certainly could follow up and ask.
Yeah, it might be worth doing that because some colleagues at the CDC were pretty clear about that regulatory distinction. So it might be worth checking back because I think that nuance might be lost unless you sort of specifically call it out.
But even for volunteers, Rafi?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Interesting that you could require something for a volunteer, but you can't require it for a paid staff.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that you can require of volunteers that you can't for paid staff because paid staff are protected under the labor laws and volunteers are not. Very, very different.
Yeah, and it's not so much that you can require it, you just can legally exclude volunteers who haven't done what you've asked. Which you can't do that to paid people the same way.
Sure.
Gotcha.
All the little nuances, right?
I'm not going to pretend to know the law itself.
So how about this? We'll look into those nuances all together and we'll get back to people.
Thank you. Other questions that people have?
So I don't know if this is the right terminology, but we're getting either some pushback or some not understanding because our schools in Texas are back in session. So it's kind of like, well, my kid's going to school, so why can't my kid come to camp? And I mean, we'll figure out how to deal with it, but that they're being exposed in that kind of a setting. That's one of our challenges right now.
Yeah. I'm going to tap dance, if that's okay. I think a lot of things that are happening in Texas right now are challenging and confusing, including the decision to remove the mask mandate and open things up again. So I can understand why parents and staff are confused about the kind of messages that I'm stating and sort of what's being sort of locally implemented. And I don't have anything intelligent to say about that.
I think we're getting a little bit of that as well. South Dakota hasn't been the most restrictive either on some of our rules. And so we've had a few questions about, well, my kid's back in school, why can't we do camp? And we've just said that we have to make decisions for our immunocompromised patients, and it is what it is. Someone thinks you have nice dance moves, Rafi.
They clearly have never seen me dance if they think that. But to come to people can share the truth.
Not as good as Dennis.
It looks like Mississippi may be removing their mask mandate as well. So I suspect this is going to be a challenge that will be addressed by some camps as things open up. So have people thought about that? What might you say if you make the decision to still not do in-person camp, and how you answer that? Before we open it up, there is a question. Are any certain cancers more at risk than others?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that question yet, because I don't think we have enough information. I will just share, which is only parenthetically related to this, on the TKT call we had last weekend, something that I learned something new. Apparently kids who have, or individuals who have Down syndrome are at risk for greater COVID complications than are kids without Down syndrome. And of course, we know that kids with Down syndrome are also predisposed to a lot of malignancies, and so are often represented in our camping populations. And we looked into it a little bit, and it's actually multifactorial. It turns out that I think everyone understands with COVID, you can get an upper respiratory infection with the sniffles and the snots, or it could go into the lower respiratory tract, which is progression of that, and you get pneumonia. And then there's a third phase where the body's attempt to fight off COVID develops a life of its own of almost volcanic proportion. And it has an inflammatory reaction independent of the actual viral infection. And turns out kids with Down syndrome are more prone to that inflammatory overload. And in addition, they often have sleep apnea and other medical problems that are associated with worse outcomes. So I didn't know any of this as a non-pediatrician, but it makes sense. And so there are clearly certain conditions which are more risky, but I don't think we've fully defined what they are yet.
And I think as is being pointed out in the chat room, I think a lot of us serve not just oncology patients, but maybe some hematology patients. And for example, our sickle cell patients, and how does that play into their higher risk with COVID as well?
There is some data in adults suggesting hematologic cancers like leukemias have a worse time with COVID than have worse risk with COVID than do solid tumors. And then there's just an article out this week about sickle cell disease, and if you get COVID, you can get a higher rate of thrombotic episodes, vascular stuff, all that. So it's just starting to come out now.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, the new sickle cell articles, though, are pretty convincing. Those kids are at high enough risk that they've been moved up in some of the different state treatment algorithms, state vaccination algorithms.
Again, it seems like the data continues to evolve, that we keep learning more and more to how to narrow or how to approach some of these very difficult questions. Thank you for sharing that information, everyone. Other questions, things people wanted to bring up or discuss about this topic?
I was just going to say, I guess we're lucky in that we had a virtual camp in 2020, and we made the decision pretty early on that that was going to be our call again for 2021, because like you said, Rafi, we just can't live with ourselves. The risk is too high. You know, for us, we felt like the risk was too high to outweigh the benefit of having in-person programming. But we haven't had any pushback from any of our families. A lot of our families are extremely conservative, and they are, you know, we're doing social distancing and masking prior to it being a socialized thing with COVID. So that's unfortunate for some of you guys that are really experiencing that, because I think, you know, being able to provide this service in any way that we can is still incredible. So just keep on keeping on, and know that I'm a pediatric oncology nurse too, so I've seen this firsthand and, you know, lived it on the front lines for the last year. And I think that anything that anybody can do to support these families is incredible throughout this pandemic. So just kudos to all of you guys for doing awesome stuff.
Thanks for that. Dr. Rafi, maybe a different question. If a camp decides that it is the right thing for them to do, to have some family programs or whatever is right for their facility, what are some things that they should think about as far as maybe cleaning procedures or some social distancing? Any thoughts about how you would approach having a camp, if that's the right decision for your camp?
Yeah, it's super challenging. I believe different states probably have different regulations about how, you know, what sort of air filtering requirements there are in buildings, and what the cleaning routine needs to be around restroom facility use. And I mean, it's hard to get excited, and I don't think I could in good conscience get excited about authorizing not social distancing, you know. So I think it's hard for me to imagine camp feeling very campy in a socially distanced environment that we would be forced into. Maybe I'm just not creative enough to imagine it. But I think it would be really challenging. And some of the things that we all love most about the camp experience, the hugs, the closeness, the gathering in spaces, and the communal meals, become really, really challenging to do safely. So I think local laws are going to need to come into play a lot, and it's going to be a really challenging conversation. I wish I had something concrete to say this is how to do it, but it's really complicated.
If you do come up with it, please write that down and then send the proceeds to COCA, because that's going to be very, very valuable. Dennis Tecumseh doesn't get it, COCA does.
I think COCA is going to be instrumental about figuring out what the best practices are as we come out the backside of this. That was not good terminology, was it? But you know what I mean. You know, I think it's everyone's collective experience and intelligence that's going to lead us out of this back to in-person camping. I'm just too in the fog of this right now to be able to see a clear pathway out. I'm convinced there will be one. I just don't see it yet.
Rich wants to know if that was the one joke that we were supposed to catch on the slides.
No, Rich. The one joke was, where are we? You are here. Get it? That was the joke.
All right. Other questions people wanted to ask? We're coming up to that 45-minute mark. I don't want to cut this off. It's a great discussion, but also want to make sure we're covering questions. This group's not normally so quiet. I think, Rafa, you gave all the information at the beginning, so they were like, hey, we got what we needed.
Either that or I bored everybody to tears and they just want to go to bed.
No, nobody signed off. I think you're still doing okay. Dan, would you go ahead and put that slide up? So
I do have a question, actually, Dr. Rafi and anybody else out there. So those of us who aren't going to be in person for 2021 are already looking at 2022. with some sort of like magic 8 ball trying to figure out what would that look like. So you already mentioned that it wouldn't feel campy without the community feel to it all. What are we thinking for 2022? What's our predictions, and where would we need to be in order for that to be back to camp status?
You want my crystal ball, or are you asking the general group?
Well, you got the box, so go for it. You can anything else.
So I just shook the magic 8 ball and it said ask again later. No, I'm actually really optimistic for 2022. I am. I do think that vaccines are going to knock down the caseload. I think it is going to be this game of whack-a-mole. I think there is going to be another difficult winter. But I think that we are going to get ahead of this. And I'm really optimistic for 2022. Optimistic, maybe that's not the right word. I'm really hopeful that things are going to return to normalcy by the end of this year. That's as close to a prediction as I'm going to make. I know there are a number of other medical professionals on the call. If you want to weigh in and tell me I'm crazy, feel free, please.
So since you were looking at your 8 ball, what NPIs do you think will have to go forward into 2022? Do you think we'll still be masking, distancing? I know some practices like hand washing stations and head to toe sleeping and some of those things will probably be with us forever, but.
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. My hope would be that masking would be limited to kids who are in treatment, and that everything else we would be able to relax. I think hand hygiene, I wouldn't cry if it was here to stay, right? I mean, I know at Tecumseh, we've been trying to get people to squirt their hand sanitizer before meals, for years before this. So I don't think any of us would cry if that was higher on people's priority list. I have to say head to toe sleeping is not something that I've heard about or thought about before. So that's a new one on me. But I'm hopeful that hugging will be back in fashion.
The head to toe sleeping came from a Camp Nurses Association presentation that I'd seen.
My brain goes all sorts of sort of places trying to figure out, how that works in, with kids who have incontinence issues and other sorts of issues. But I guess I can sort of imagine that the idea of coughing, sneezing, aerosolized secretions not being right up against someone else's respiratory tract is the motivation. I just hadn't heard of that before, so thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're wondering about in California is if we can require campers to have been vaccinated, not just the volunteers and the staff once it gets out of EUA status, but whether there's enough risk to other campers that we can say to be part of the community at camp, you need to have had the vaccine yourself too, and whether we can swallow that and then whether we can sell that.
I suspect that that's going to be settled in courts. Because you can imagine that going to legal challenges. And I don't know the answer. I don't know the law about that.
There would likely be some state-to-state variability on that as well, based on immunization laws in general. So suspect that's going to be individualized by where your camp is located to some extent.
You also mentioned EU status. When do you think that might be lifted? I understand those usually take a while.
You mean getting full regulatory approvals?
Yes.
I honestly don't know. I don't know. I don't have even a guess as a timeline for that.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. We've come up to a little past our 45 minutes here. Jen, if you will, or Knuckles, if you would put up the other slide, just a reminder about some other upcoming webinars that we have. Wednesday, March 10th, we are going to do a game night with Knuckles. Could you explain a little bit about what a Dutch auction is, Knuckles?
I can. So over at COCA-I, we call it a pillowcase auction, but you get 15 minutes to grab a pillowcase and grab some household items that you think will be called off on the list. And then after those 15 minutes, once your pillowcase is full, we will go off of a list that I have of creative things, and you can try to use whatever is in your bag to kind of like fulfill the request of what is on the list.
Awesome. So everybody join up, try to think of all the great things you can grab from your house that Knuckles might find on his checklist. And then on the 30th, on the 24th, Matt will be leading a Come Get Crafty with COCA-I and Arts and Crafts Hour. Matt, what are we going to be making?
It's a surprise. No, we actually have several projects that we're going to do. We'll be posting shortly all the list of supplies. So if folks want to get their supplies ahead of time, they can, so they can actually do the crafts. And then we'll do some sharing of craft ideas, and hopefully y'all walk away with not just a craft project for yourself, but one for your camp.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then March 30th, a disaster plan. Prepare your camp for disaster in five easy steps. This is going to be given by Patrick Hardy from the Hytropy Disaster Management founder. Sorry, I cannot talk tonight. If you guys are like me, I never really thought about the need to have a disaster plan, so I will certainly be tuning in to learn about that. And then in April, we'll be having a session to talk about how to train your staff after there's been a gap in your operations. And that's going to be with several folks from Camp Hackard TV. So please join us for those. We thank you again for joining us tonight. Some other webinars that are going to be coming up, and some requests that have been made for interest. If you have ideas or topics you'd like addressed, please let Jennifer know that. And thank you again for joining us tonight.